You guys are so good at communal honor that I don't even need to really do this session because you're like the stars of communal honor, honoring each other and so forth. But let's get started. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
The sun is kind of shining. This is good. So I'm excited to welcome you to the next chapter, chapter 5 of The Cost of Ambition. It's a chapter with a title named after a very fascinating question. A question that Paul asks the Corinthians. What do you have that you did not receive? It's a rhetorical question, one of three. And it's meant to challenge the superior-minded Corinthians to adopt a more communal approach grounded in Christ's example. As we have done through the series, I want to begin by inviting you into a few minutes of silence to consider where you may be in terms of competitive superiority or just to express gratitude. And so the bells will bring us in and then out. Okay. Last week, if you were here, we explored Apostle Paul's critique of striving for superiority and his proposal, his instruction really, of a different way, the Christian way. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. So this week, in chapter 5, Professor Volf stays with Paul And he explores essentially more deeply one of the roots of last week's instruction. A root that I think of as the root of receiving. All is a gift from God. So if you weren't here last week, and if you go to the early service, I'm Alan Lynch from the 10:30 service. I'm also God's gift to the world. Now wait a minute. That's an obnoxious and extremely boastful statement, right? Especially from a man who's only had one cup of coffee this morning. Paul didn't approve of boasting at all, even though, interestingly, in 2 Corinthians, he boasts quite a bit. The form of the world labels a statement like, I'm God's gift to the world, as that of a narcissist. Turn it into a question, the statement becomes a put-down. Who do you think you are? God's gift to the world? Now, truth be told, I didn't open up chapter 5 with the perspective that I'm God's gift to the world. But I did close it with the perspective that I am God's gift to me. Hopefully you'll see how I got there. Speaking of the way of the world and gifts, I love stupid jokes. I told a few of them last week. So thanks for coming back. Last week I related that as a corporate lawyer, I was trained to look for the exception. But that's not all. I was also trained to create disclaimers and disclosures. As in the following. These jokes are, well, corny jokes. You hereby acknowledge that corny jokes are the best I can do while staying, on the high road. You acknowledge that in college, you acknowledge receiving the disclaimer that in college I was a runner and some of my teammates called me a cross-country punter. I was known as the cross-country punter. I guess I earned the reputation. You agree that there are worse ways to spend your time right now, such as being in jail. Void where prohibited. Audience participation required. So with those disclaimers out of the way, I have some questions for you. What's the best way to start? I grew up Catholic, so this was kind of relevant. What's the best way to study the Bible? Anyone? You look into it. These are like the fundamental, to go from Catholic to Protestant, you've got to get the fundamentals. How do you make holy water? Say again?
I said poke holes in it.
Okay, poke holes in it? No, you boil the devil out of it.
What'd you say?
You boil the devil out of it. I warned you, the disclaimer was right there. What kind of lights did Noah use on the ark?
Floodlights.
Wow! You get a prize! Good job. Good job, Jan. Bingo. Let's see, Jan, if you get this one. Who was the fastest runner in the Bible? Father Dean? Ooh, when you can stump a minister, you're on something. Adam, he was first in the human race. Ooh. Okay. What did Moses use to make his tea?
To make what? Tea.
To make his tea. Let me make it a little less weirdly difficult. How did Moses make his tea?
Old Testaments?
Interesting. He brews it.
Oh.
Bada boom. Okay. There you have it. A non-theologian who enjoys telling bad jokes. At first I thought, that's probably not a good combination for adult formation. But then I realized that even esteemed theologians joke around. Just wait and see. So, in secular terms, as we all know, the season of gift giving is right around the corner. To work our way into this morning's topic of giving and receiving, I have a few more serious questions for you. So, what I want to do is explore just for a few minutes, as a way to get us into today's topic, is gift giving and gift receiving. And specifically, what have been some of your favorite gifts that you've given and you've received? And how did it make you feel, that gift or those gifts, as both the giver and the receiver? So, if nobody volunteers, I know who to pick on. Like Jan, sorry.
Well, some of you who've heard part of this story at Christmas knows that when I think back, my favorite gift growing up was not what I wanted. What I had wanted was these high-heeled shoes. I was 13 and I thought I could trip wonderfully. And back then, the Sears catalog was our wish book.
Yes.
And so I had found the exact pair I wanted, and I had circled it a bunch of times. And I had strategically left it out. Because in our family, my dad was a pastor. We didn't have a lot of money. That seems to go together. We would get 3 things for Christmas, us kids. We could always come on new pajamas, new underwear, and one something other, right? With some toy or something we really wanted. Well, I was the eldest. I wanted my shoes.
Okay.
When Christmas came, there was a flat box under the tree, and I knew it wasn't my shoes. And when I opened it, it was a scrapbook. And they had cut out pictures of all the things they wished they could have given me.
Oh, wow.
And in the center was that pair of shoes cut out. And then they wrote, "We wanted to do this, but we didn't have the money. But what we are giving you is our prayers. We're going to pray every day for where your feet go.
Wow.
It's more important than what's on your feet." Wow.
Do you still have the scrapbook?
No. Nor the shoes.
That's an amazing gift story. Yeah. Do you want to come up?
No.
Grab the mic?
Alan, I wanted to say something to you. When you started out with all of this, I thought it feels so good to laugh. Thank you. With so much going on that can make us just weep or cry, it felt good to laugh. Thank you.
I'm going to tell that to my children.
All the bad dad jokes.
Oh, yeah. So, other stories, special gifts, the one that you gave or the one that you received, and how did that make you feel? Joel.
My wife has been a really remarkable gift giver for the entirety of our relationship, which is like 37 years now. In college, we were both kind of came from straight-laced places and were moving to less straight-laced places. And on my birthday one year, she walked in with this black motorcycle jacket, leather, and it was just so magnificent, and like exactly where I wanted to be, and what I would never have invested by for myself.
Yeah. Do you still have it?
I do.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
Did you wear it this morning? No.
Yeah.
Okay. Others? Yes.
Last Christmas, my husband, Andrew, picked out, not only got us a new couch, but picked exactly what it was and like did all the work to decide which one we're getting, which was, I think, more of the gift than the couch itself. Like taking the time to find a good one that would be delivered, that would fit with our space, that would fit with our decor, that
Wow. So the way that the couch was given.
Yeah, I don't have an eye for design, and he
Yeah.
knows me well and knows that I wouldn't want to like go to a furniture store and pick it out. So that was a gift.
Bill.
So I think I speak for probably every husband in the room that one of my favorite gifts, maybe the most favorite gift that I've given, is the engagement ring to my wife. Which of course has meaning to me and to her. But that seems way too obvious. And when I was thinking about the course of my day, one of the favorite gifts I've ever received has essentially no economic value at all, unlike an engagement ring. And it's a mug that a man gave me when I was going off to college with the seal of the college on it. And it was just a nice gesture. And every morning I see it when I walk into the bathroom, and it's got my comb in it. And so something that mundane that reflects a bond from somebody who's long since dead is, I think, an expression of the milk of human kindness that each of us longs for. And that in that case, as in many cases in our lives, is unexpected and therefore more meaningful. Whereas, I mean, nothing against me as the giver of the engagement ring or my wife as the receiver, but it wasn't a total surprise.
Yeah. Right. So what's interesting in listening to stories like this is people tend to focus not on the thing or the lack of the thing so much as the feeling, how they felt, either as the receiver or the giver. And I find that interesting. So I have a personal gift story for you. This is what I learned from, that's not Joanne, by the way. Although she does have brown eyes. That's Winston. And this is the story of Winston Jr. So our beloved dog, Winston, when he was around 11 years, I can't remember exactly, he was starting to slow down, as we all do. And like in a lot of families, he became a full-fledged member of the family. In fact, we talk about social hierarchies, which is underlying this whole subject. He was ahead of me. He was very superiority-minded. So at that time, Joanne and I lost both our fathers very close to each other. And with Winston getting older, I became concerned, how's Joanne going to be when Winston passes? So I decided that I would give her a King Charles Cavalier Spaniel puppy. And I looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find a breeder. There was one in Alamo, or whatever, Timbuktu, but I couldn't find a breeder within, 300 miles of Boston. Until one day I was randomly looking at work. Don't tell anybody. Bill. And I saw that there was a woman in Andover that had a litter of King Charles Cavalier Spaniels. And so I called her up, and as I'm, dialing the number, so to speak, I thought to myself, this is going to be the best Christmas gift ever. because this was all going on in early December of that year. And the breeder, she was not the easiest person to deal with. She said she couldn't hold the puppy without a substantial deposit. So I provided said substantial deposit. The pressure was on. So my daughter Alexis and I, we hatched a plan. We set up a phony dinner date with her best friend's parents, who we knew casually from school things. And they lived in Andover. So it was all very plausible to Joanne, except it got harder and harder to keep up the charade because, we had to change the date, the breeder, the timing, all this other stuff. So we kept lying to Joanne like a rug. Now, meanwhile, back at the office, my colleagues were pretty excited about this. Like it was a Netflix episode excited. And they got invested. They were helping me come up with things, to make the plan work better and so on and so forth. So finally, the evening for the dinner came and we set off. We all got in the car with flowers for the Atarians. They're real friends, but they were fake friends on that night. And a large green bean casserole. And when we got to the Atarians, the breeder, who was a feisty Asian woman, answered the door and led us into her kitchen. And there they were, these 3 adorable puppies and the mother. Surprise! And I turned around and Joanne put her hands to her face. So I couldn't really see her reaction. And then the rest of us, we bent over and started fawning over these puppies. And then Joanne put her hands down, and the breeder looked at her and said, and I quote, verbatim, "What's the matter? You don't love puppy? Everybody loves puppy." Joanne had, instead of tears of joy, tears of sorrow streaming down her cheeks. So I very awkwardly gave the flowers to the breeder, as well as the green bean casserole. And we left without Winston Jr. in the car. And on the way home, Joanne broke the silence and said, "I already have the dog I need. I don't want Winston to feel like he's being replaced, like he's not number 1. There'll never be another Winston." So in reflecting on what thereafter became known as in the office as my epic gift fail, I mean, they were stunned at this turn of events. I'm not kidding. I now see sort of a connection to chapter 5. And it's this: the best gift is the one you've already received. As Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians, in the verse immediately following our main text, already you have all you want. All right, speaking of gifts, I have one for us.
Well, you can't end it there.
Oh, yes, I can. But go ahead.
What happened to Winston Sr.?
Well, Winston Sr. lived for 4 more years.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was very hard to say goodbye, as it always is. But there will be a Winston Jr., but not for a while. Yeah. And I've learned my lesson. I won't spring it on her. I'll wait till she's ready. So I have a gift for us, and this is one that you have to pass around. And it's not a possession. But I do want you to take a minute to look at the wrapping. Sorry, but the secular wrapping, which is adorable penguins, is covered. It's covered with a different kind of wrapping, a divine reality wrapping, if you will. And it's the kind of wrapping, I think, that Professor Volf, interpreting Paul, invites us to focus on. it's also a free gift. This is unmerited. You just had to show up, and I'm going to give this to you. So take your time with it, because these are some of the foundational texts that underlie these sometimes difficult to grasp concepts. But the thing I love about Professor Volf is he has a humanity and a joy in his theology, and he brings it literally down to earth in a way that makes it relatable and accessible to us. So, speaking of Paul, Apostle Paul, while the gift goes around, I want to orient us a little bit to a distinction that Professor Volf makes, I think, really throughout the book, and I didn't bring this out last week. We did talk about the type of ambition which is really necessary, to be communal and to be helpful and so forth, versus the toxic ambition. But we didn't talk about the distinction between superiority and excellence. And I think this is important to point out. Superiority, of course, is competitive, comparative, and ultimately divisive. Excellence, by contrast, is about faithful stewardship of one's gifts for the common good, not to outshine others. So, Volf isn't saying don't be excellent, actually just the opposite. And Paul is saying don't be excellent, just the opposite. Strive for excellence, that kind of excellence, instead of being superior compared to others. So last week we discussed Apostle Paul's conversion through the lens of striving for superiority. We talked about his writing to the Roman church to kind of tide them over until he could get to Rome. That letter was sort of like, hello, I'm Paul. Let me introduce you to Christian doctrine and practice. In chapter 5, on the other hand, we find Paul laser-focused on Corinth. It's the Corinthians' turn to receive Apostle Paul's instruction. In contrast to the Romans, Paul's two letters to the Corinthians are more like, really, people? It's Paul again. I'm back. Forget about Apollos and those others, because Jesus is our Lord, and I'm just the suffering man to tell you about it. In chapter 5, Volf touches on Paul's conversion when he references the cursus honorum, the sequential order of public offices that aspiring politicians in Rome had to go through to achieve their status, their rank. And this comes up in Volf's description of Paul's bedrock moral instruction. And I really love this because it just, to me, encapsulates a lot of what Volf is saying about Paul, and Paul saying to us. When he embraced Christ, he gave up on the cursus honorum, the race of honors. By entrusting his life to Christ, he affirmed the value of loving others more than himself and treating them as if they were higher than himself. That is the bedrock of his moral instruction. Apostle Paul, you see, gave up Saul's race for honors, for a different kind of race. Now, just to set the scene, Paul had planted the Christian church in Corinth around AD 52. But despite this, and his spending time personally ministering to the Corinthian believers, serious trouble was brewing only a short time later. Around 53 to 55 AD, he's in Ephesus. So he writes his first letter to the Corinthians. By the time he writes his second letter to them, around 56 AD, he's in Philippi. And word gets to him of a full-blown rebellion in the church in Corinth. As Professor Volf writes in chapter 5, Paul is determined to put an end to the Corinthians striving for superiority. His first letter didn't work. In his second, he takes the gloves off to correct their misconceptions and restore the church to its proper foundation in Jesus Christ, emphasizing the importance of unity and love. So what's going on in the Corinthian church? Let's talk for a second about Corinth. It's the leading city in Greece. It's the commercial hub. Like every city, it has its good and it has its bad. As to bad, think the underbelly of Vegas. We've got hedonism, we've got idolatry, we've got folks worshiping all kinds of false gods, right? In Corinth, there are no less than 12 temples to choose from. In this one, the goddess of love, Aphrodite, was venerated. The church that Paul planted just a few years ago amid this idolatry is in the throes of a schism. The contending parties have each identified with a leader that they feel represent their respective beliefs. Some stay with Paul, but increasingly, others align themselves with Apollos, or as Paul calls them, super apostles. So, who is this Apollos? First I thought it was Apollo, like the Greek god, but no. Apollos, to quote Volf, was an eloquent teacher of wisdom. He's a Jewish Christian from Alexandria who is mighty in the scriptures. And he's ministering in the church in Corinth, and many Corinthian believers have become totally enamored with his eloquence. And what was the main issue causing the strife? Volf writes, the rebelling Corinthians want a God of wisdom and strength, the God of the resurrection. They don't want Paul's humble God of crucifixion, foolish and weak. They want leaders who will rescue them from living close to the bottom of the social hierarchy. Apollos reminds me of a modern-day televangelist preaching the prosperity gospel. Volf tells us that the believers who are enamored with him prefer a theology of glory, a superiority theology, over Paul's inferior theology of the cross. But actually, Paul, apropos our last chapter, outdo one another showing honor, he actually has some nice things to say about Apollos later on in Corinthians, thus practicing what he preaches. So this faction, they're striving for a new religious kind of superiority. And they're drawn to leaders like Apollos who can give them this sense of superiority. As you'll hear Professor Volf say in the video, the rebellious Corinthians are very interested in being superior. Why? Because their theology, it has a period instead of a comma. They only go so far as God elevates the inferior. Full stop. They're saying, hey, that's us. We were down, but now we're on the way up. I thought of this like they want to stand tall on the rock that's been rolled away from the empty tomb, but they don't want to see the bloodied cross. And Paul is essentially saying, as amplified by Volf, you can't have one without the other, right? So in many ways, the heart of the chapter, as reflected in the title, are these three rhetorical questions. And with that context in mind, we'll zoom in on Apostle Paul's most direct rejoinder to these superior-minded Corinthians. And that is the point he makes after asking these three rhetorical questions in 1 Corinthians 4. Now, of course, the answer to a rhetorical question is implied, right? It's not given. It's implied in order to make a point. And with respect to these questions, Professor Volf sheds light wonderfully, beautifully really, on Apostle Paul's implied answers, and he amplifies the point that Paul is making here. So let me quickly break down these three questions. Paul's first question essentially is, what makes you something special? What makes you something special? Answer, I do. I make myself special by associating with someone who can lead me to greatness. So given the Corinthians' proclivity for boasting, this implied answer really requires no explanation. It's implied, and reasonably so. It's the starting point for Paul. So then he asks, what do you have that you did not receive? The implied, if not appropriate answer, negates the answer to the first question. And the answer is nothing. What do you have that you did not receive? Nothing. Volf calls this question the core of Paul's argument. And it's a setup to support Paul's point, which comes next. When Paul asks, and if you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Apostle Paul answers his third question, because your boast is based on a lie. A lie. Volf's explanation of this is a takedown of boasting. Since you agree that each of you received your very righteousness from God, you should affirm that everything you are and everything you have is received. And if you received everything as a gift, and your very existence is also a gift, then there is no basis for boasting. That's Paul. Now, Professor Volf. Boasting, like striving for superiority, rests on a lie. Praising yourself for your achievements is a lie because God, our Creator, gives everything to us. Ambition rooted in boasting or superiority is unfounded because nothing truly belongs to us. The phrase, my personal possessions, is misguided. So is pride and self-sufficiency. Achievements should be occasions for gratitude, not boasting. Of Paul, he writes, he delegitimized boasting based on how God works in creating. The bottom line, my friends, is this. All talents, all achievements, all positions, everything is ultimately received from God. So there, now you don't have to read the check. But please do, especially since Bill is here. And we know that Bill is a friend of Professor Volf. So I want to just pause here and open up for any comments or discussion before I quickly touch on some of the other themes in the chapter. What strikes you?
Question.
Bruce?
So, why do you think it is that we don't just respond with gratitude and instead try to arrogate to ourselves that we've achieved this great thing? What are we after? What are we hoping for? That isn't this better than the thing that's been given to us that we haven't earned?
So essentially Bruce's question is like, why? Why don't we just follow Paul? Why are we ascribing to ourselves our achievements and things and really our life itself, our lifestyle, our life, our way of living? Why are we ascribing all of that to ourselves? And
what are we hoping for?
And what are we hoping for? And I mean, there are lots of different answers, I think, to that question, but the way I would answer that question is because, in a sense, it's very, very difficult to follow the example of Christ. It's very, very challenging. As we mentioned briefly, this is a radical message that Paul has. It's radical because it's so contrary to our culture, the way our culture is structured. He contrasts this race of shame of Christ. I mean, think about that, a race of shame that Christ ran versus the race of honors that was expected if you were to be somebody in the Roman culture. You were either, on the race of honors, or you were a slave or nobody. And anybody that studies history and scripture, and I know we have people who know a lot more about it than I do, will, I think, in some way recognize and communicate in their teaching that human nature never changes. And things are much more similar than we think to AD 56 in Corinth. Other thoughts? Paul?
We live in a society that doesn't honor nothing. To go back to your answer before that Paul was implying. And I think therefore there's a built-in insecurity that we have to put Christ over things.
That's interesting. So we have a built-in insecurity to put Christ over other things. And you might remember the video from last week where Volf very insightfully says, one of the things that's really a roadblock for us is our own inferiority. We think we're inferior to others, and therefore we have to run this race of superiority. And Volf said, but think about parents at the birth of a child. There's no status, there's no rank, there's no degree, there's nothing. You've arrived, he says, just like that. You've arrived, and it is good. And that is enough, that's all you need. And it's our culture that piles everything else on top of it. And so I think that inferiority really is a very interesting underlying roadblock to all this. Yes? Okay, so as I mentioned, there are some other themes, of course. Chapter 5, like any one of these chapters, we could spend the whole 6 weeks on just one chapter, right? So I want to just quickly touch on some of these other core teachings. There we go, okay. So chapter 5 and Paul in Corinthians is in a sense a rebuke of the Philippians' theology. Referring to Apollos' fan club, if you will, Volf writes, and we referenced this earlier, from Paul's perspective, theirs is an ideology of losers who crave the tables to be turned. Paul considers their theology of glory a betrayal of the gospel. He reminds the Corinthian church about what they signed up for in following Jesus. I love this. What they signed up for in following Jesus. Hey, you signed up for the cross. If you're a believer and you say you're following Jesus, then you signed up for the cross. Second theme, replacing superiority, pursuing superiority with cultivating humility and mutual honor. True greatness, modeled by Christ, is demonstrated in humility, servanthood, and the honoring of others rather than seeking dominance. Volf advocates replacing the pursuit of superiority with humility and mutual care, thereby destabilizing status hierarchies and enabling authentic community. When you think about it, authentic community, the hierarchy, there's always a hierarchy, okay? But it's just less of an obstacle to connection in an authentic community, right? Third thing, be co-laborers, not competitors. Here's where Apollos comes back in to the story. Paul actually uses his relationship with Apollos, this sort of televangelist, if you will, guy, the rock star minister. He uses that relationship as a model of how Corinthians should relate to one another. Volf writes, they're a team. Paul planted the church, and Apollos waters it. Paul ultimately rebuked the Corinthians for the factions, emphasizing that both he and Apollos were merely co-workers for God. Apollos was not at fault for the division, and in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul expressed high esteem for him. Outdo one another in showing honor. There it is. As an aside, I wonder, who is this guy, Apollos, right? So I researched him, and I was interested in his reaction, what happened after. And Apollos, was actually disturbed by this factionalism, and he left. He left Corinth for a time because he didn't want to fuel the dispute. He later shows up in the epistle to Titus, where Paul sends him on a mission to Crete, co-workers. Winning the race of honors comes at a high cost. Volf's point here is that seeking superiority leads to mental instability, anxiety, social division, and spiritual emptiness. He contrasts this with the race of honors in Roman culture. And he sets these two races apart that we talked about, the race of honors and the race of shame. The race of shames is a race of self-emptying love, which redefines what glory and honor means in the Christian life. And then finally, the paradox of strength and weakness. And in many ways, this is the central message of 2 Corinthians. Of course, Paul's opponents in Corinth valued worldly measures of success: wealth, charisma, impressive public speaking, and so on. And they criticized Paul for his suffering as being weak. You know, Paul, who suffered incredibly, shipwrecks, attacks, and we ultimately know what happened to him when he did finally get to Rome. Paul argues that his physical weakness and hardships demonstrate the power of God at work, not his own inadequacy. The key verse here is when the Lord tells Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So let's hear how Professor Volf sums this all up, and also how not to be a jerk.
Well, one of the ways in which we can push against the idea of striving for superiority is to ask the question, what makes us to
Can you
be
make that louder?
who we are? Do we ourselves and our achievement makes us to be who we are? And I think once we start thinking this way, there's a kind of lie involved. For instance, somebody who is very obviously successful, suddenly you ask, well, why is that person successful? And has that person given themselves their existence, their talents? You say, well, that person has worked very hard, but has that person given themselves ability to work so hard? And you can reflect upon how much actually of who we are we owe to ourselves, and how much do we owe it to luck, to our parents, to place where we have been born. The thing is, you don't know where to draw that line. And so for you to kind of praise yourself for some kind of achievement ends up involving a lie, even if you just observe our lives. But the truth about us is that we have been created by God, and that God holds us in existence over the entire span of our lives. We have been given to ourselves by God. So God has given ourselves to us, which is to say our lives are a gift. And that's why Apostle Paul has this very fascinating question that he asks Corinthians who are really interested in being superior. And the question is, what do you have that you have not received? Pause. And the expected answer is, I don't have anything. And the next question is, why do you then boast as if you have not received it? And the response is, because I'm a jerk. So Apostle Paul's point in asking these questions is kind of self-awareness, insight into who we actually as human beings are, and out of that insight that we have been given to ourselves, follows that what we have is there for us to be in communion with others and to honor more, especially those who have not been given as much, so that there would be equality. And in 1 Corinthians 12, that's exactly how Paul motivates why we should honor those members of the body that do not have as much honor, so that there would be equality. And I think that's what we're striving for. It's a recognition of truth about ourselves, and that's a beautiful truth that allows everybody to come in the communion of those who all have been created by God and together are the sight of God's glory.
All right. I love that they didn't edit out that as like a blooper or something like that. Because, like I said, for a theologian, he is so down to earth and really full of joy. So we have just a couple of minutes. Any closing thoughts or observations about all of this? Bill?
So the one thing I would add, and maybe you can go back a couple of slides.
Oh, now you're challenging my technical
Oh,
ability.
sorry, Alan.
No, I got it, Bill. Come on.
One more. Sorry, maybe a couple more. Back again. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So I think that it's relevant that the ESV translates question number 1 differently. For who sees anything different in you?
Interesting.
So you can read, is this NRSV?
Yes.
So you can read the NRSV translation of question number 1 as a put down of differences. But in fact, all of us are different from one another. Each of us has gifts that our differences exhibit. Some of those differences might make us feel less than others. Some of them might make us feel superior than others. But we have differences, and those differences are gifts from God. The question is, or 2 questions, is A, what do we do with those gifts of difference? And B, what is our attitude about those? Which is really the 3rd question. And I think that difference in translation between for who makes you different than anyone else and who sees anything different in you is a way to think about the appearance and also the reality that we are a very pluralistic world. And the differences between us we can view as vehicles through which, channels through which we glorify God. And so I think part of what Miroslav is teaching in this book is that the wide spectrum of difference can be a vehicle through which we walk closer to God, and through our witness, we offer a model that is at odds with the culture of this world. Especially in the context of a highly competitive place like Yale, it's very helpful to recognize that distinction in my view. And so it may seem like a trivial difference in translation, But I think we live in a world in which we do see difference, and we need to make appropriate inferences about those differences in a way that ultimately leads us closer to God in how we walk and how we love.
Amen. That was like the closing prayer. Thank you. Speaking of the closing prayer, I will close us in prayer. Almighty God, thank you for this time we've shared. Help us to affirm that the answer to Paul's question, what do you have that you did not receive, is nothing. We acknowledge receipt of a most precious gift. You have created us, and you have given our very selves to us. In Jesus' name we